our entire livelihood as engineers is going to depend on this at the end of the day, right? It almost feels like we are now authors of a article or book every time we send one of these out. It's important we're good at this, right? This is going to be how we interact with agents probably forever. You know, whether you subscribe to loop engineering or graph engineering, either way, it relies on some form of a prompt. So what we're going to look at today, we're going to look at kind of the Commonwealth perspective, right? The average Joe, actually we'll just call this average Joe. The average Joe in question is not an average Joe, he's actually pretty smart. But we're gonna look at his takes on prompt engineering, and then we're also gonna look at the official labs, right? OpenAI, Anthropic, probably mainly OpenAI, because they have a lot of resources on prompt engineering. And the end goal today is to be better engineers, right? We're going to start off with the common perspective. So this is an article from Addy Osmani. He discusses how a poorly phrased request can yield irrelevant or generic answers, while a well-crafted prompt can produce thoughtful, accurate, and even creative code solutions. So we're going to investigate what his perspective is on a good prompt. So he gives this list out here. He shows pretty clearly the technique in question and then also its purpose. So I'm going to evaluate these kind of from my perspective and see if I align with everything that's being said here. So number one, he lists out role prompting, otherwise known as role playing. And so for instance, let's say you're designing a front end for a web app. You might tell it, hey, you're a pro UXer, dude. And the idea is that this will kind of give it some constraints as to what it's focused on and maybe give you a better result. So he mentions that the purpose is to simulate expert level code review, debugging, or refactoring. The example he gives is you are a senior X developer, review this function for Y. Now I do have a little bit of pushback on this. At least from my experimentation with role prompting, it's more visual. And by that, I mean the way it interacts with you is impacted. If I tell it that it's a senior engineer, I do find it impacts the output, but mainly in how it's interacting with me, right? It'll come back with more details. It might be a little bit more verbose in certain areas, right? It'll kind of go out of its way to add on to things to make sure that it gives the illusion of being a senior engineer, but it doesn't necessarily to better code. Right? I've never found this to actually impact the code in a productive way. Maybe you have. I did find this paper, so it's titled, When Does Persona Prompting Actually Help? It does mention, prior findings on persona prompting remain mixed, with role LLM and related work suggesting that role prompting can improve reasoning, domain adaptation, and role consistent behavior. So there are some definite proofs there. And kind of as I was mentioning, they found in their testing that response length analysis reveals a consistent verbosity increase under role prompting. And so there is value in this if you're interested in, actually reading the functions that it spits out and you're working through a spec. There is some value in doing something like role prompting. As far as code goes, I don't see as much value in it. Even in their conclusion from their tests, they did find that overall, it pretty much just reshapes the response characteristics and doesn't have a direct improvement over the capability of the model, right? You're not gonna, if you take a model that messes up on something and just say, hey, you're a senior now, odds are this isn't gonna improve it. If this does improve it, like the slot machine just hit that day. Let's go into the next one. So the next one mentions explicit context setup. And he mentions that framing the problem clearly to avoid generic surface level responses. This is a no-brainer. I think this is absolutely a good technique to employ. The more, clear and specific details you can give in your prompts, the better. I'm a big proponent of problem, expectations, methodology, right? Clearly state the problem that you're having and then your expectations of it. Ideally, you go deeper than this, right? You're actually explaining kind of what's going on at a lower level, right? So one example might be, let's say you have a problem where, one problem I encountered recently was images not loading later into the PDF. And so this is a case where I was kind of dynamically generating images as the PDF went through, and it was based on the content of the PDF. I could have fed this straight in as the problem, and honestly, this would work. But you could go a step deeper, right? You could say, okay, images not loading later into the PDF. Maybe you can be more explicit and say images PDF, and maybe actually add on like, hey, works fine for earlier pages, possibly pointing to a rate limit issue with the images API. Right, you can go a little bit deeper on why that might be happening, and I find that this produces a better output. So if you just go like this, right, there's a lot of possibilities. But if you give your theory, which I think, if you have experience working in the field that you're working on, typically you can give your guess of what might be the happening issue. And so although this prompt example here, this technique, it doesn't list this out, I think that this is a good thing to employ. So I would give this a check. I think this is a good strategy. Input-output examples, this is also good as well, right? So kind of to the example I gave, I think you kind of give the input-output expectations expectations already within this, right? Your expectations is that it's loading the image. And so really these could be kind of similarly bundled, right? Being explicit about the input and output, that's a great technique. And really the more you give here, the better. I mean, there is a point where it's diminishing returns, but anytime I'm giving an input and output expectation, I like to give several. If you only give 2 examples, sometimes that's enough. But if you gave a third one, it would guarantee no confusion. Next, we're on iterative chaining. The purpose for this one is to break larger tasks into steps to avoid overwhelming or vaguing the prompts. This one's a bit risky. I think it definitely can help, but you run the risks of if it truly sticks to your plan, you have to really make sure it's a solid plan. All right, an example he gives here, first generate a skeleton of the component, next we'll add state, then handle API calls. This works fine in this case, but let's say there was a dependency on the state before creating the skeleton, right? I can envision a world where we need to have these defined before we're allowed to make the skeleton. And so you might have it execute on a very set list of tasks that it was supposed to actually do in a different order. Task 1 depends on task 2, but the user doesn't know that when they send the prompt. There's that risk there. So I think this is a good technique if you fully understand the order of operations well. You just have to kind of think a little bit about it. You wouldn't always want to do this. Definitely depends on how much knowledge you have going in. Debug with simulation, so it shows the purpose of this is to get the assistant to simulate runtime behavior and surface the hidden bugs. This seems like something you typically would send post-prompt, right? When it comes back to you and it says, hey, all's good, this might be a follow-up prompt that you send it where you're saying, hey, can you go through, walk through, is there anything that you see that may cause an issue? I think this is a good technique. I would say it can be good. I don't think this is something I would do all the time. I think it depends on which code you're talking about, right? If it's a piece of code that actually has a lot of importance and a lot of, impact if something goes wrong, this makes sense. Probably wouldn't want to do this for everything that goes into your code base because you could be wasting a lot of tokens and really over protecting certain things. So for mission critical stuff, this definitely seems like a good technique. Featured blueprinting. I think we can all agree this is good to go through the planning steps with the LM. I would actually kind of bundle 6 and 8 together though. And the reason I say that is because a lot of the times you come up with this blueprint, right? You define the spec and it's a great spec and all, but I think it's good to ask the LLM any alternatives, like really see if there's something that you might have missed in your own blueprinting. And one thing I often do is I'll add something like only high ROI, which this basically gets the LM to not go out of its way to alter your spec unless it sees something critical. I find this works all the time. And so personally, I recommend once you've done your blueprint, feed it back into the LM and say, hey, do you see anything high ROI that we may have missed? And then you can kind of evaluate from that. Instead of, which, really this is kind of mentioned in number 8 here. Number 7, code factory guidance. And so this is kind of focusing on maintainability. Personally, I do this a lot with code bases that I'm working on long-term. Although I think we've all kind of gotten to a point where we don't read the code all the time, there's definitely value in maintenance of your code. I've always said our job as engineers now really is being a janitor, making sure that everything is as clean as possible and nicely laid out. And so for this, I do this quite often. I'll look at kind of, rough outline of the code, see where it's placing the code, right, just in the file structure. And that's, just focusing on readability. There's also obviously performance, idiomatic style. These are things that you do kind of over time as you're developing your app. Like typically when it first implements something, it may not be thinking about performance, right? Because there's trade-offs to make, right? Performance has a trade-off. So the LM isn't always going to go all balls to the wall on performance because it knows that there's a certain trade-off with it. And so you may need to come in and say, hey, yeah, let's align this for performance, or let's align this for, reliability, or whatever the case. Or like I said, if you're, planning to maintain this long-term, readability really does matter. And so it kind of makes sense to use this technique for that case. Asking for alternatives, we kind of already harped on that one. Rubber ducking, this is something I mostly do when I'm not coding. Oftentimes I'll ask an LM something and I'll say, am I misunderstanding? Now it's important to note, depending on which model you say this to, will have an impact. I find Grok is very much on the side of proving you wrong, whereas OpenAI, Anthropic models, they will try their best to make sure you're not misunderstanding. So like they'll find nuggets of what you said and say, oh, you did get this part right. I feel like Grok does not try to do that at all. It does not want you to succeed, which is often why I prefer it for more critical thinking tasks that aren't coding anyway. But this is a good technique. I wouldn't say I use it very often for coding, right? This idea here of does this reveal any bugs? Really, this is kind of what we would expect from number 5 because it already wrote the code for us. I think this would work if you're the one handwriting the code for sure, but I wouldn't see it as a separate step from number 5, at least with coding. Constraint anchoring, this is a good piece of advice as well, right? Trying to, you might explicitly call out. I would say this is really in the realm of always being explicit. So if your first prompt says, hey, we have these constraints, you specifically say, don't do this. As you go down and down in your prompts and the context window gets larger and larger, it's definitely good to bring this back around as often as you can. Because you have to realize, like, typically it's, depending on how the harness is designed, it's going to send this again as you send more prompts. And so it is going to keep reiterating this. But as, the context window gets larger and larger, it becomes easier for this to get lost in the weeds in the bundle of context. And so I do strongly agree that it's good to reiterate your constraints as you go on, and especially if you're starting a new one, right? I always make sure to re-establish constraints with every new prompt window that I start. That's a good technique. So now we've got, the average Joe perspective. I really think these were really good, really good. I actually expected this to be a bunch of dog water, but addy osmani knows his shit. So this is a good list here. The only one I would push back on a little bit is role prompting. I wouldn't consider that to be code. I think it's good for specs and communicating with the LLM, but I wouldn't use it directly for writing the code. So the next thing we'll go into is the official labs, right? OpenAI, they have some prompt engineering guides, and we're going to go through those and see how they change or differ. And so here we have the best practices for prompt engineering. This is directly from OpenAI. It was updated just 10 days ago, and so it's still fresh off the press. It starts off by saying, due to the way OpenAI models are trained, there are specific prompt formats that work particularly well and lead to more useful model outputs. Turn on a dark mode. There we go. Now you have dark mode. Okay, so the first piece of advice here, use the latest model. We need your money, right? We need your money. We're charging more for these models. We need you to use the latest one. Obviously, that's not the only reason. I do find that there are times where an older model actually performs better. Part of that could just be in their training process. I'm not, there's a lot of reasons why that might be. I think it's a good piece of advice, right? Using the latest model, but I wouldn't completely write off older models. But this isn't really prompt specific, so we will continue on from there. They do call out that, prompting technique differs between reasoning models and kind of a non-reasoning model. Unfortunately, they don't really double click on what that means, right? They don't give any advice on how you should change your prompt depending on whether it's reasoning or non-reasoning. I think it's worth mentioning that non-thinking models could technically become reasoning models. Right, if you prompt a non-reasoning model a certain way, it will become a reasoning model, right? You just have to tell it specifically to iterate over its thoughts. And so really, I think the main thing they're saying is that you don't need to do that, right? Whatever you send off, you can assume it's going to reason about it. Whereas with a non-reasoning model, you'd have to be a bit more specific and say, hey, I want you to think this through over and over and over again, right? Spend more time in that inferencing step. The first, main real piece of advice here, put instructions at the beginning of the prompt and use comments to separate the instruction and the context. I'm definitely guilty of not following this advice. I typically just paste my stuff in. But as you're seeing here, they really recommend you be explicit and add quotations to the things that you're inputting. It would be interesting to see how this impacts the cost and maybe effectiveness, because certainly it has to think a little bit less, right? It doesn't need to kind of suss out what is the thing that you're trying to summarize and then a bunch of other stuff. But this seems like a reasonable piece of advice. So if you're in the ballpark of just pasting in your stuff without any kind of separator, definitely consider doing this. Number 3, be specific and descriptive and as detailed as possible about the desired context, outcome, length, format, style, X. This is pretty much what we were talking about with the layman perspective, which is to really just be very explicit, right? Instead of saying write a poem, you go a little bit deeper and you give exact intent, right? You can kind of view this as your input and output expectations. Number 4, articulate the desired output format through examples. Again, pretty similar to the advice we read earlier from Osmani. And I think it's worth noting that there is some care you want to have with this. If you're not familiar with the thing that you're working on at a level that you can specify the input and output, this could actually be a detriment. So like, let's say I was calling an API. Let's just call this the Pokemon cards API. I don't know where that came from, but so you call this. If you don't know the specific input and output of this endpoint, like let's say it supports get card, maybe a get for the owner. Like if I give a very explicit input and output expectation to something I don't understand, you do run the risk of this running the LM in a pit where it doesn't know what to do. And it tries to do this, but it can't figure it out. And so I think it's worth adding on to this, articulating the desired output format through examples, but then also make sure you know the examples. I think you're better off not including examples if you don't have a full understanding of what it's capable of. So use this a little bit carefully. And so in this case, the example they gave, right? So if you know all this information, definitely worth including. Number 5, now this one's interesting. Start with 0 shot, then few shot. Neither of them worked, then fine tune. Right, you don't want to stuff everything at once. You want to kind of give it some structure. And so instead of sending like a massively wide prompt in one go. And so the example they gave here, start off with 0 shot. Right? Here's our text in one block. Here's our keywords. And if that doesn't work, then you granularize it and then you go a little bit deeper. Number 6, reduce fluffy and imprecise descriptions, right? This is human fluff. So they mentioned this is a less effective option. The description for this product should be fairly short, a few sentences only, and not too much more. Better is to say explicitly, use 3 to 5 sentences to describe the product. Right, this is much more precise, and it's also just getting the point across right away. I think we've all heard the importance of a succinct email, right? We don't want 9,000 words to read through before we get to the problem. Kind of the same for the LLM, right? We don't want it to go through all this information if we can do it shorter. I don't think we always know exactly what we want in every case. And in some cases, we're okay with it not being exact. And so I think that's why they say reduce it. I don't think they say don't do it, because they know that there are cases where it is beneficial to do it less specifically. Right, kind of an example I gave earlier with the API that you don't fully understand. In that case, it is kind of necessary to be less precise because we want the LM to have the leeway to figure that out itself. Number 7, instead of just saying what not to do, say what to do instead. This is pretty interesting. I don't think I've heard this one. Because honestly, when I'm prompting, I always focus on what to do. I think I rarely send a what not to do. But so I guess their piece of advice is if you are going to say what not to do, make sure you're also saying what to do. That seems pretty reasonable. Number 8, code generation specific. Use the leading words to nudge the model towards a particular pattern. Right, as we know, these LMs are effectively pattern matching, and so it does make sense to kind of lead it in the right direction. So in this case, they give an example of style, whereby once you put this import in, that tells the LM, hey, we can start focusing on Python now. Obviously, this is more of an inline coding thing, not really prompting. I'd actually say this isn't even prompting advice. Surprised this isn't prompt engineering. This definitely does not seem like a prompt engineering piece of advice, actually. Yeah, OpenAI messed up on this one. Sam, fix this. This is not prompt. But overall, these are pretty much in line with the layman version that we saw.